Before attaching the top panels, I realized that we had to find a way to get the ring out of the way when we were working on it, but you can't put the ring on after the top panels because it's smaller than they are and it won't fit over top. So what we're doing here, starting off by hand and then switching to the jigsaw, is cutting a slot which is down from the ramp area, and that'll allow us to hop the ring up past its end point, go over, and then drop it down around the legs. Our spacer blocks for the main slides are looking pretty good. We've got them cut to the right general size, knocked all the edges off, but what we need to do is mark out where the arms tie in below and clear out a space for those so that they don't interfere. However, before we get to that, and this eventually became sort of the theme of this week, which was starting on one topic and then backing up to another one to improve it before moving on, we wanted to get in here and remove some of the play from the arm connections. The play that you just saw was only on that end connection. When you add in that on both ends, you end up with quite a bit in the system total. And it wasn't this bad at the beginning, because originally, these are just regular screws that are in there, and I drilled them a little bit big so they wouldn't bind, and then the threads that are sitting by that shaft have worn away over time. So what we want to do is upgrade to a screw with a shoulder on it. I opted for the brass screw, not just because of the classy feel it gives to the project, but also because it has a shoulder in this particular length, which is wider than the threads. A lot of screws don't have that, and that's a problem because we're going through metal, so you can't, in wood, if the threads are wider than it, they'll just cut into the wood, and that's what you want. So in this case, we had to have that, and then we trimmed off the end here so that it won't stick out below and dig into the lower level. For screws like this, I run them all the way down and then back it off just a touch to give it some wiggle room. And after that, you can see that the wiggling has been significantly decreased, so we like that. Moving to the other end of the arm, to the center here, we can see that these screws need to be upgraded as well. The original screws were fine for a while. I used pretty short ones because I didn't want them to stick through the bottom and interfere with the other side. But in the meantime, I've opted to start using longer screws for things and just cut them off. The screw that I was originally going to replace this with didn't have a large enough shoulder, and even though it's the same number 10, I believe, size screw, the one that's slightly longer does have the right size shoulder, but there aren't enough threads once it sticks down through. So we're going to go with another pan head, but longer, and just nick off the end with an angle grinder as necessary to keep it from interfering. The reason that we're using pan head screws here is because I need the vertical clearance. You can see that this one looks like it has enough room, but it really doesn't because the bottom piece rotates. It's the lower level, and there isn't much clearance up high either between the upper level and the lower position and the top of this assembly. Now that we've gone around and upgraded everything, it's important to go through and make sure that there's still a little bit of play just to keep things from binding. Even a set of gears has to have some play between them, despite being a finely machined surface. So we check this one just to make sure it can click, and then we take all of them here and in various positions, because since things change height and not everything is exactly the same height, for example, the top of the main slides and the top of that star is a fraction different. And since those arms also are not straight, they tend to pull to one, they want to twist down a little bit. So it's important to just try it in different positions and give it a wiggle and make sure that everything is smooth, which does appear to be in this case. The upper slides are a little bit different story because they go up and down. Underneath, the arm that pushes it in and out is fixed. It's at a fixed height in the center, and then it comes out here, which means that its angle changes. For this reason, we want it to have some flexibility in the top part where it's going through the wood, but down here on the threads, that play is unwanted. So we're going to add a nut down there to tighten it up. If it wasn't clear before, that arm has threads tapped into it, so we can use a drill here just to run in the bolt. And that's a nylon lock nut, so when we tighten it down, it should hold pretty well in this application. Play does appear to be reduced, so we're going to call this a success. While I mentioned close tolerances on that center star, it applies to other areas too. You can see here on the upper slide as we close it that the arm for the lower slide, which is next to it, comes across and barely clears underneath the bottom. That's why we had to use such thin material on the bottom of the top slides. Now that we've worked our way back to the lower level spacer blocks, We drop them in place a few times and see they need a little extra material removed. So drop them in the vise and use our chisels here in high speed mode. It looks like butter when you're doing it this way. And just give them a little bit more space there for the arms to rotate side to side. Then we drop them in place and fasten them down. The hole in the center is for the arm mounting screw, so that we can leave this block attached to the slide even if we need to disassemble everything else. Now it's time for one of my least favorite tasks on this table, which is mounting the top panels. It's nice to get it progressing towards its final form, but really the only way to do it is to put them all together in the collapse position where you think they should be, hold them down with something like these weights, expand it, compare where it should be, collapse it again, compare where they should be there. You have to iterate 2 or 3 times around, and it's just time consuming. I did get away from cardboard shims though and started using screws, because you have to adjust some of these. Not everything is going to line up perfectly the first time. And I don't know why I didn't do this earlier, because I use these in other situations and they're great. If it needs to be up a little bit, down a little bit, you put the screw like that. If you want to finalize it later for something that was much stronger, you could use that screw to tell you where your hard shim should be. And it saves you fastening through the shim again and again. We've got a list of details still to take care of, but since it's all together and mostly adjusted, I thought we'd give it a test drive. So first, we're going to drop the skirt by rotating. Then, we'll open the table up. Now that that's complete, we'll bring our skirt back up, lock that into place, securing everything, and let it back down. Finally, bring the skirt back up. Now that the ring is approaching its final form, I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about why I went with this ring strategy. This ring is underneath, it rotates down, lets it come out. Pretty simple. The other way that you could have done the ring was to have it come up on the outside here. And that has a couple disadvantages to my way of thinking. One of which is that these panels have to be in exactly the right space for that ring to come up and not have much of a gap around it. It would probably be best to have a taper on the bottom side of this so it could come up. That makes it more difficult. Trying to route a taper on a perfect circle just sounds much harder. It's just less forgiving in general. And then when the ring comes up, the height has to match perfectly also. It'll either be a little bit too low and leave some of this exposed, or a little bit too high and create a lip. That could be troublesome. Now in contrast with this ring, it's pretty simple. All it does is go down like that, and it helps support it as it locks against it. You can hear a little friction there in both cases. Having the one on the outside would give you a little bit of a lever advantage, because instead of being supported here, it would be supported here. It's not that big of a difference, so I think it'll be fine. It's quite strong. The other thing that I want to mention is how the skirt plays into the shape of it. This table is circular right now in the small position, okay? And then it is not perfectly circular when it's large. And so I get questions from people who say, how come some of the other ones, like the Fletcher design, for example, is circular in both states? Why can't yours do that? Well, here's the thing. You can't be circular in both states just by adding pieces in between. It just doesn't work with geometry. I mean, if you can figure that out, you'll probably win yourself a Fields medal, or it'll have to be in other dimensions or something like that. Because you can't have this radius match a circle that's any other size than this one. So what the Fletcher one does is that they have an arc, a larger arc, for the circle when it's out here, and when it comes in, it sits like that, and this space here is taken up by the ring that, by the skirt when it comes up. You can see it if you watch carefully on their video. And the other disadvantage to that is that that skirt then has to come up straight into that position because it has corners. So that skirt has to have two parts to it. It has the lower one that rotates and rises, and the upper one which stays rotationally still and only comes up. That gets very complicated. For this one, we need to be simple and just reliable. Simplicity equals reliability, certainly. This one's a solid ring, one piece, couple sets of rollers, that's it. Speaking of those rollers, right now they're mounted on regular bolts, which stick out the side and do a great job, but aren't super aesthetically pleasing. So a few people had mentioned carriage bolts or things that are similar to that, and that's something I had in mind, but I also was at the hardware store looking for those screws with the shoulders and stumbled across something called an elevator bolt, which is really just a carriage bolt with a flat head on the end. The flatness is important because that way it won't stick out beyond the ring, and being larger it'll also spread out the force over a greater area. I don't want to have it on too small of a part because it might crush it in or allow it to wiggle. To sink the head of the bolt in, we'll use my next largest Forstner bit, which ended up being kind of a tricky operation because I had already drilled that 5/16 hole through for the other bolts, and it wanted to wiggle around a lot. But we did our best, and it fits pretty well. This would be pretty easy to cover up somehow, maybe put a little veneer over it on a final installation. It took a bit, but now we're ready to work on the star. So there's a couple things I wanted to point out about the star as a refresher, or if you're not aware of it. The most important one is that there are 3 levels of surface in this table when it's collapsed like this. We have the top levels, we have the ones in the middle, and then the star, which is underneath. Okay? So we're going to rotate this a little bit, and we can see here, you have the top level, this one, and then the star, which is underneath. And what that means is that when we want to raise everything up, that star has to come up twice as far as this level, okay? And the star has some additional restrictions. When we lift the panels that are underneath here, we're doing it over an arc, which in this area is about 6-7 inches, okay? So it's happening over about this much of the arc when we're spinning it. That lifts these ones in between up 1 inch. This needs to come up 2 inches, but everything for that star has to be contained in the center, which is only about this big. So instead of having this much space to put a ramp, we have this much. Now if we have to come up 2 inches and we're going over maybe 1.5 inches or 2 inches, that's a very steep incline. There's a lot of force involved. So ramps are out for bringing it up. The way that I brought this one up, this star mechanism, just spin it open here, but I will stop like this. Is that we have these pieces which are sitting in the center. These are anchored right to the frame. And then when we bring up this level, these are lifted up in the middle. So this length goes up 1, the total length goes up 2. And it lifts it up twice as much. And I spent a lot of time thinking about how to pull this off. I thought of a lot of different ways. Some of the failed attempts are over there. But it felt like some simple solution could do this. And I finally settled on this. Now, what are the problems with this? The problems with this are that these lever pieces don't move. But the star that does sit on top has to rotate with this. And so the way that we accomplish it rotating in sync with the upper level is to have these pieces which hang down. And they catch, and it makes it follow this. And then to maintain its position like this, but to be free up and down, we have another one of the hardened shafts, and there's a piece in the center there. So what we would like to do is to have basically this system. Well, okay, so the problem then with these not rotating is that it fights against this piece. okay? And introduces a little bit of wiggle because we have to have some play there. And these are difficult to adjust because you can't change the length this way, changing the anchor point. We need something that's a little more adjustable. So what we need to do, and what I would like to do, I think, for the new plan, is to use this same strategy, but to anchor these in the center to the lifting level and have it hang down and have sort of a mushroom shape in the center that these will be under and then lift up. Okay? I'll draw a little bit better picture here in a second. That will keep this surface from riding on here and allow us to simplify the top area on this part. The center part in there will then be able to take that friction, but the friction and the sideways force gets translated directly into the frame instead of into the star. One way that I'd like to minimize that side-to-side friction also is by having a small Lazy Susan bearing. We have a large one down in here which holds all this assembly, have a smaller one under there which kind of hangs underneath, and so when this piece is sitting underneath there, it can go sideways and really cut down on that friction. I actually had to order this Lazy Susan that I'm talking about in order to avoid driving a long ways for just one part, so it's going to be 2 days before that comes in, but we'll get to cutting then. And one more benefit of going with this system where these are anchored in the center is that this center part doesn't have to be open. Having this open means that some of the flexibility in the top layer all pivots through just these areas. There's sort of a weak point here, and this has to be routed down. So being able to have more material in here is going to be a benefit to increase the upper level stiffness. And that'll help with adjustment on some other things. Not a huge benefit, but any benefit that I can get, I will take. That's about it for this week. I'm sorry we couldn't get to making some sawdust on the actual star, but everything else is cleared out. This is the only thing left, so now we're going to focus exclusively on the star, I promise. So thank you for watching, and hope you come back next week.